Hi all, and welcome to the Medical AI Lab reading group session. Each week, a lab member covers a recent paper in either core AI or medical AI, and this is targeted to be broadly interesting to those interested in the cutting edge of AI and its applications in medicine. This week, we will have Elaine Liu presenting the paper Aligned for Fuse, Vision and Language Representation Learning with Momentum Distillation. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Elaine to share this paper with us.
Hi all, so today I'll be presenting on the paper Aligned for Fuse, which is a paper authored by a team at Salesforce Research. And the method they propose in this paper falls under the vision and language pre-training regime, which aims to learn multimodal representations from large-scale image and text pairs that can improve downstream vision and language tasks performance eventually. And in my understanding, I think during pre-training, it's very important to teach the model to learn how to model the complex interactions between the image and text features so it can achieve visually grounded language understanding and vice versa. And before we dive into their model, I want to give a little bit more context. So according to the author, so currently a lot of the existing VLP methods rely on pre-trained object detectors to extract region-based image features first, and then they employ a multimodal encoder to fuse image features with the word tokens. And an example of this is the Oscar model we learned about 2 weeks ago. And this VLP framework suffers from some limitations. So first of all, it's very challenging for the multimodal encoder itself to model the complex interactions between image and text because they lie in their own embedding spaces. And secondly, object detectors are very expensive to use. They are annotation expensive and compute expensive if it's part of our pre-training regime. And last but not least, existing pre-training objectives such as masked language modeling may overfit to our noisy image text pairs because currently a lot of the most popular pre-training methods use data cropped from the web. So sometimes these image text pairs might not correlate very well. So this can degrade our model's generalization performance on unseen data pairs in the future. So this team proposed this novel model architecture to kind of tackle these limitations we just talked about. And this model is named ALBEF, which stands for Align the Image and Text Representations Before Fusing. So this title kind of summarizes what this model is doing pretty well. So the model first encodes image and text independently with a detector-free image encoder and text encoder. And then they use a multimodal encoder to fuse the image features and text features through cross-model attention. So there are kind of two layers going on here. And before we dive into how they actually train these models and how they're structured, I want to point your attention to the momentum model on the side, which I think is one of the most interesting ideas in this paper. So the momentum model, to give you a preview, is basically a copy of the unimodal encoders and the multimodal encoder. But the parameters stored in the momentum models are actually the exponential moving average versions of the parameters from the actual encoders in our model. So this is going to help us to achieve something called momentum distillation, which we're going to cover shortly as well. And now to look at the structure of our model in a little more detail, I wanted to tell you how these models are initialized. So the image encoder uses the vision transformer, and it's initialized using the 12-layer VIT B16, while the text encoder uses the 6-layer of BERT. So it's actually initialized using the first 6-layer of BERT base, while the multimodal encoder uses the last 6-layer of BERT base. And a little bit more about our pre-training data. So we use this 4 sets of core data, so including conceptual captions and SBU captions, which include image with their text caption to form a data pair. And then they also use COCO and visual genome, which are the data sets that people are probably pretty familiar with. And I think because they also want to show that their method kind of scales with larger training data size. So they also did experiments on a larger data sets, which include a much noisier conceptual 12 million data sets, which put our total number of images to 14 million compared to the 4 million images from the 4 main data sets above. And now we're going to dive into the training method. And in total, the paper actually proposed to use 3 training objectives in total. And because the structure is a little bit complicated, we're going to dissect them kind of layer by layer. So first of all, we're going to look at how the authors train our unimodal representations. So they actually use image text contrastive learning. So I think contrastive learning has been probably one of the most popular methods in self-supervised, computer vision learning or multimodal learning in the recent few years. I think the idea here is similar. So they kind of want to teach the model to distinguish image and text pairs that share similar semantic meaning versus those pairs who are, describe very different things. And how they achieve that is through the steps we're going to talk about here. And this contrastive learning is a little bit different from some of the methods used in other papers. We're going to address that in the next 2 slides as well. So first of all, we encode our input image into a sequence of embeddings. And this is very similar to how VIT does it. So you have a sequence of embeddings that embed the M patches from an image, and then you label them from V1 to Vn. And on top of that, you also prepend an embedding for the CLS token in front. And the CLS token is basically used in both vision transformer and BERT and a lot of transformer models. It stands for classification or class. And the idea is that they really want to use this token to learn a generalized or like a summary of what's really in the image or what's in a sentence. As you can see, the text is also encoded in a similar way, where it's a sequence of embeddings of different words prepended by the CLS token embedding. And when we compare the text and image, and when we compute the similarity score, we're actually only going to look at an embedding for the CLS token, the VCLS and WCLS. And how we achieve that is that we add a linear transformation layer G on top of these 2 embeddings, and then we take a dot product, which is a very standardized way to compute similarity between 2 vector representations. But here's the tweak. So I think in some of the other methods, we usually compare the similarity score between every possible pair of image and text within a mini batch. But here we're actually maintaining 2 queues to store the most recent M image text representations from the Momentum unimodal encoders. So just to remind you, the Momentum unimodal encoders are the exponential moving average version of our actual unimodal encoders. So it kind of stores all the historical, parameters, but it's like slowly updating itself according to the actual encoder. But this M is usually much larger than our mini batch size. And this approach is actually inspired by the famous paper Momentum Contrast, which MOCO, which I think one of the ideas that by using, a lot more negative pairs and to achieve a larger dictionary size, you can teach our model to learn better. So we are going to denote these representations from the momentum encoder as G prime V prime and G prime W prime. So when we are computing the similarity scores, we're not actually computing the similarity between all possible pairs within the mini batch. We're actually computing every text with the queue of the most recent M image representations from the momentum encoder. And I try to draw this illustration here. So this STI score is computed by first you put your text in your mini batch through the unimodal encoder to achieve this GW representation. And then you have the G prime V prime representation of the M image representations from your Q, and then you kind of take dot product between each of them. And then once you are done with this step, you have your SIT and STI between all possible pairs. We are going to compute the softmax normalized image to text and text to image similarity for each image and text. So this idea here is that if your image and text match up pretty well and share similar meanings, we want the model to output a higher probability here is that they're similar. And if they share very different semantic meanings, we want the probability to be low. So that if we let yi to t and yt to I to denote the ground truth one-hot similarity between the image and text, where negative pairs have probability 0 and positive pairs have probability 1, then the image text contrastive loss can be defined as a cross entropy loss between this image to text P and the image to text Y, as well as the text to image P and text to image Y, to achieve this expectation of the sum of cross entropy loss. And this is how we define our image text contrastive loss. And now we're finally done with our first objective. Let's look at the second one, which is the masked language modeling objective on the multimodal encoder outputs. So masked language modeling, and some of you might be really familiar with, so it's really commonly used in a lot of language models. But here, we want to utilize both the image and the contextual text to predict the masked words from a sentence. So this is the approach used in this model is very similar to BERT. They actually probably followed most of the BERT approach here. So we randomly mask out some of the input text tokens with a 15% probability, and then we replace them with a special token mask, where the replacements are 10% random tokens, 10% unchanged, and 80% mask, following the BERT approach. And here, we want our model, the multimodal encoder outputs, to predict the probability for a mask token. So if, and we have this Y mask to denote the one-hot ground truth probability vocabulary distribution. So if the model is able to predict that masked text correctly, we can minimize this cross entropy loss. And now we finally arrived at our third objective. So in order to teach the model to learn a bit better, this group of authors added this image text matching loss at the end of the multimodal encoder as well, to predict whether a pair of image and text is matched or not matched. And how this is done is that once you have the multimodal encoder's output embedding of the CLS token, and this is the CLS token because through modal attention, you want this token to really capture a joint representation of the image text pair you're looking at. And then we append a fully connected layer followed by a softmax to predict the two-class probability, P, image text matching. So if it's a match, then it's a high probability, and if it's a not match, and if it doesn't match, it's low probability. So we can achieve at this cross entropy loss, which is going to give us our image text matching loss. And now we're finally went through our all three training objectives. I want us to look at the momentum distillation, which is used along with the three training objectives to teach the model to learn a little better. So the motivation behind this is that when we have a lot of noisy image text pairs from the web, sometimes the caption might not correlate with an image very well, or sometimes there are some potential candidates among your queue of other texts that might describe your image equally well, even better. And if we only give the ground truth, text and image pairs probably 1, then we're kind of penalizing the model for thinking that the other reasonable pairs as correct. And this could degrade the model's generalization performance. So that's why the group of authors proposed this self-training method, which learns from a pseudo targets produced by the momentum model. And to give you a quick recap about what knowledge distillation about. So usually during model distillation, we have a teacher model and a student model. And we aim to minimize this loss function so that the student model can learn from the knowledge in the teacher model. So by matching the logics predicted by the teacher model. So here our teacher model is actually continuously evolving, which consists of the moving average version of our actual encoders. And here's the authors didn't really give an update function, but this is the update function that MoCo uses. So you kind of update the momentum encoder using this parameter M. So it's basically you use your parameters from the original momentum encoder plus a part of your unimodel encoders that's been recently updated. And here is an example about how actually let's look at how momentum distillation worked for image text contrastive loss first. So basically, we want this momentum model to predict the pseudo probability distribution where the momentum encoder might think certain pairs are equally reasonable, then it's going to give these pairs of image and text equally high probability. And then the way we do that is it's similar to how we computed the image text similarity loss in our previous ITC objective. We take a similarity score S prime, but instead we are going to use representations of the image and text classification token, both from the momentum encoder. And then we're going to use this S prime to compute our self pseudo target distribution, Q image to text and Q text to image, by replacing S with S prime in our previous softmax probability formula. And then we're going to define this new loss function to not only learn from our ground truth probability distribution, but also our pseudo targets generated by the momentum model. So this is a weighted version of the LITC loss we talked about before, plus this KL divergence score. So to give you a quick recap, KL divergence is a measure of how one probability distribution is different from a second reference probability distribution. So the idea is that we want our model to not only match the ground truth labels, but also match the pseudo targets that deem as likely by the momentum model as well. And here are some of the examples of the top 5 most similar texts selected by the momentum for the image text contrastive loss objective. So for example, you can see here, the ground truth caption for the picture is a group of water lilies. And you can see some of the top 5 pseudo targets deemed reasonable by the momentum model just describe the image equally well. For example, water lilies covering a pond or a group of water lilies. So the idea is that we really don't want to penalize the model too hard for thinking these pairs are correct. And for max language modeling, it's similar. It's a similar approach where they also use KL divergence to achieve the pseudo target distribution for the masked text, so that we don't penalize words that fill in the blank equally as well as the ground truth too harshly. And due to time, I'm not going to go through that in detail, but definitely encourage you to read the paper. And now let's look at the experiment results. So after talking about all these objectives and the momentum distillation, so how well does this actually perform? So first in the paper, they actually talked about several the ways to fine-tune ALBEF to downstream vision and language tasks, including image text retrieval and VQA, etc. But due to time, I don't have time to talk about the fine-tuning details, but I definitely encourage you to read the paper if any of this interests you in your application area. So they did evaluation of different, basically vision and language tasks using different combination of the training objectives that I just talked about. So they tried different combinations of the 3 objectives. They also tried it with or without the momentum distillation. But of course, you probably already know the best performance is achieved by the ALBEF model, which stands for using all three objectives with the momentum distillation on image text contrastive learning and masked language modeling, plus a momentum distillation step on the downstream tasks as well. And in terms of image text retrieval performance, in particular, ALBEF was able to achieve state-of-the-art results compared to other models, such as Elaine and Oscar and Villa. And surprisingly, it's able to beat the very popular Elaine model using only really a fractional of the size of the Elaine data size, which is 1.2 billion. And in terms of zero-shot image text retrieval results on Flickr 30K, it's also able to beat the very popular CLIP and Elaine model using only 14 million data compared to the 400 million data size used by CLIP and 1.2 billion used by Elaine. So I think potentially this model can be very data efficient when we're pre-training our multimodal. And then last but not least, here is some comparison with state-of-the-art methods on other downstream language tasks, such as VQA, and now VR. And then we can see that it's able to beat a lot of the popular models. So I think this shows great potential. And in terms of visual grounding, the author actually did some experiments using the GradCam visualization to really visualize the cross-attention maps used in the multimodal encoder to make really the results a little bit more interpretable. And then we can see that in terms of the VQA task here in figure 5, the model is really able to pay attention to the correct regions of the image when the question is a specific question is asked, and the attention is quite similar to where humans would pay attention to when answering these questions. So I think although these results might be cherry picked, but I think this shows potential that this model can really model the image text interactions really well. And I think that concludes my presentation, and thank you so much.
Thanks, Elaine. That was great.